Hey, folks, thanks for joining the Wednesday edition of the Frank Figliuzzi Show. If you joined me on Monday with Asha Rangappa, your curiosity may have been piqued as much as mine about the powers of a president that we may not know a whole lot about. And that is a hot topic these days as we approach the midterms. And mostly, as President Trump seems to indicate, he's up to something. And we want to explore that even further. I know you do, because I want to separate like the fear from facts, right? And get it right about what a POTUS can do with regard to emergency situations, and particularly as it pertains to messing with our elections. So we went to the Brennan Center for Justice, and I'm thrilled that we were able to get Liza Goitein. She's the senior director of the Brennan Center's Liberty and National Security Program. Liza's a nationally recognized expert on presidential emergency powers, government surveillance, and government secrecy. Her writing has been featured in major newspapers and magazines. You've seen her on MSNBC, CNN, and you've heard her on NPR. She's testified on several occasions before the Senate, House, and Judiciary committees. Without further ado, let's bring in Liza Goitein. Liza, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you, Frank.
You must be one of the busiest people around these days because of the buzz around concerns, namely, most recently elevated because of the presidential national address the other night by Trump, where I've talked about this, I think he fumbled and failed, but he certainly seemed to be laying the groundwork for something. What did you take away from that national address in terms of your work?
Well, there were a couple of things that I found interesting about it. The first thing, and a lot of people have said this, so this really isn't adding that much, but there was very little that was new in his address. And even when he talked about, evidence that had been uncovered that the intelligence community had gathered, this was all basically stuff we already knew about, and information that was to some degree or another already in the public domain. There's a little more in the public domain now, but it's the same, essentially, intelligence that has been looked at again and again and again. And just time after time, the intelligence community has come to the same conclusion that there was not actual interference with the election by China. So the main thing that struck me was how little he was actually saying. The other thing that struck me, though, was at the end of his address, his call to action was for people to call their members of Congress and ask them to pass the SAVE Act. Now, the SAVE Act is very dangerous legislation that would disenfranchise millions of American citizens. However, this sort of mechanism of calling your congressperson and asking them to take action, I mean, that's how things are supposed to work, right? I mean,
Right.
that's if you want to see some kind of change in the laws that impact elections, first you go to the states, because states have primary authority, but Congress does have some authority over elections. And so you would go to Congress. What he didn't say is, I hereby declare a national emergency, or I am taking over elections in order to deal with this threat, things he can't do. So I found that striking. Now, believe me, I'm not saying that, there's no more danger, that there's no way that the president would try to, he's still trying in various ways to exert federal control that he doesn't have over elections. And he may try to bring emergency powers into that. So I'm not relaxed about that situation, but I did find that striking about his address.
No, I agree. I went on live right after the address, and I pointed out, this is stale bread. We've heard this before. In fact, kind of in a humorous fashion, the stuff he's released, it's so-called declassified documents on a website, actually, you could read as pointing to Russia's interference on his behalf instead of China's trying to mess with our election. And we've had a China report on that, and it's largely been discounted. But yeah, the call to action, hey, contact your congressman, it may be an indication of a couple things. One, that he acknowledges he's increasingly handcuffed, and he's going to be very livid with Congress, and it's starting now. The negative thing, and I come from 25 years in the FBI, where really it was my job to think about worst case scenarios, is that he's increasingly frustrated, and particularly with Congress. And he could, after this, now start blaming Congress, and therefore I need to try to exercise my own muscles and do some things. And I want to dive into the do some things thing with you, and learn more about emergency powers or so-called secret powers, and talk to us about what concerns you the most about what he might attempt, not necessarily get away with, but might try in a manner that causes some confusion and delay.
All right. So let me start by saying that there are no emergency powers that the president has to take over an election, to exert any federal control over an election. There are no such powers. And what I mean by that is there's nothing in the Constitution that gives the president any control over elections. Again, that control lies with the states and with Congress. And there are no laws that Congress has passed that delegate Congress's authority over the elections in any way, shape, or form to the president in an emergency. And the president's powers come from two sources, the Constitution and Congress. So there is no emergency that would allow him to exert direct federal control over an election. And that's really important to know, because I think, in the minds of some people, perhaps, and maybe even in the minds of the president, if he declares a national emergency, that gives him a blank check to do anything he wants. That is not the case. There are countries where the Constitution empowers the president to take over sort of some of the functions of the legislature during an emergency, or to suspend some of the rights that the Constitution gives to the people. The United States is not one of those countries. We don't have that in our Constitution. We don't have that in our laws. So he doesn't have emergency powers that would enable him to interfere with elections, at least not directly. However, I nonetheless worry that he might think that he does, and that he might declare a national emergency and then purport to have the authority to exert control over the election in some way. I'm hopeful that could be very quickly dispensed with in the courts. So that's so in terms of sort of actually exerting federal control over the elections, that's not a thing.
We needed to hear that, we've got to keep a level head on this. But the adjacent, are there angles he could come at this from that are not directly involving the election, but rather other stuff that could go on? And let's talk through some of that. We're at war with Iran, the largest and greatest state sponsor of terrorism in history. Let's say there's a terror attack of some significance on U.S. soil. Let's say there's civil unrest because it's likely fomented by the president and his claims that everything's rigged, or the cancellation of mail-in ballots or something. Are there adjacent angles where he could say, aha, I do have a power that I'm going to exercise here?
He could try. Now, I will say that even if there was a terrorist attack by Iran, even if there were some claim that he has power as commander-in-chief to act against Iran in some way, he wouldn't be wrong about that. But his authority as commander-in-chief does not extend to control over, purely domestic functions. And we know this because that's what the Supreme Court held in Youngstown. That is a seminal case that was decided in 1952 after President Truman tried to take over the steel mills to ensure sufficient production of steel during the Korean War. And he relied on his power as commander-in-chief. He said, look, I need this steel to fight the war, and this is part of my power. And what the Supreme Court said is, you may be commander-in-chief of the armed forces, but you are not commander-in-chief of domestic industry. And the president is not commander-in-chief of elections, far from it. So while an attack by Iran on this country would enable him to militarily respond to that attack without having to wait for congressional authorization, that's what the commander-in-chief power gives him. it would not, again, enable him to exert federal control over elections. But again, that's not saying he won't try.
Yeah.
The other hypothetical that you raised is some kind of civil unrest that the president could potentially use to try to justify an invocation of the Insurrection Act or some other legal authority that allows him to deploy troops domestically. There are a couple of reasons why I think that would not be successful. Although, again, we do need to worry about these things. We need to plan for them. We need to be prepared for them. But that's different from saying that he could successfully invoke these authorities to disrupt an election. For one thing, all of these domestic deployment authorities have criteria and limitations built into them. None of them is a complete blank check. Especially when you look at the way the Department of Justice has historically interpreted the Insurrection Act, it is meant to be used as a last resort, and it is meant to be used only in situations where state and local authorities are genuinely overwhelmed to the point that they have actually broken down. That's in the words of these Department of Justice opinions. Now, I do think the courts would be very deferential to the president's assessment. But once again, deference is not a blank check. And in a situation where the president was manifestly acting in bad faith or had just exceeded any possible sort of range of permissible judgment, I think the courts could and would step in. But that's just looking at the limitations of those authorities on their own. You also have to look at how they interact with the laws that protect voting rights. We are fortunate in this country that we have very strong legal protections for voters and for elections. For example, there is a law that criminalizes having federal troops at the polls or armed men at the polls. So that would include ICE, for example. So any sort of federal armed forces that are at the polls or any armed individuals who are there at the behest of federal officials, that triggers criminal liability. Now, obviously, we can't rely on this Department of Justice to prosecute interference if the department is itself a part of that interference. However, the fact that this violates a federal criminal law could open up the potential for state prosecutions in states that have criminal laws against voter interference. Right. Plus, there's a whole range of other laws that prohibit interference with an election, intimidation of voters, and those laws are enforceable by private action, so we don't have to rely on the Department of Justice. Neither the Insurrection Act nor any other of the domestic deployment statutes contains a provision that would override those laws. And because these voting rights protections are more specific, they were enacted later than the Insurrection Act, they would govern.
Yeah, that's encouraging. We just threw up a headline where Steve Bannon said, the president will declare a national emergency before the midterms. And Bannon wields seemingly incredible power, at least he has in the past, with regard to influencing the mind of the president. So I'm encouraged by all that you're saying, yet I think what Bannon is forecasting here is an attempt, as we've talked about, to do things that could throw a wrench in things. Let's walk through that. And if he does it on the eve of the midterms, let's say we have ICE deployed or National Guard deployed for Lord knows what reason in or around the polls. And there's a myriad of reasons right now with the fraud allegations going on in Fulton County and in California. How long, first of all, will a court entertain a request for an injunction or injunctive relief before something's actually materialized? Or are we going to have to see those armed troops and then go to court and get some resolution?
It very much depends on the circumstances. Yeah. I mean, if it's a surprise and completely out of the blue and there's no reason to anticipate it, then the courts wouldn't step in until it actually happened. That's very unlikely to be the case. We're likely to see some kind of statement ahead of time, some kind of planning that becomes public. But even if we don't have that, it's not that easy to mobilize and deploy troops. It takes some time. And so that process of mobilization would be visible. So I very much doubt we'll be in a situation where we have to wait until the damage is done. But even if we were in that situation, the courts can act very quickly. We saw that in the Alien Enemies Act challenge when migrants from Venezuela were put on a plane and deported to a notorious prison in El Salvador. Right. The plaintiffs rushed before the court, and I think certainly within a couple of hours, I can't remember the exact number, but very, very quickly, there was an injunction from that court. So courts can act very quickly. You know, everybody is reading the same tea leaves. Mm-hmm. People are ready. People are planning. There are systems in place to make sure that that the vote will be free and fair. Another thing I would point out is even if there were an attempt to disrupt elections, for example, by deploying troops, it can't be everywhere. It can't be in every jurisdiction, right? This is going to be at most a small handful of jurisdictions, even if it were to come to pass. So the vast majority of voters don't really have any reason to worry about this happening. And in those cases where it could happen again, people are prepared.
You mentioned, preparation for sure and reading the tea leaves. So we've heard recently that the House and Senate are engaged in tabletop exercises right now, walking through scenarios and how to counter them. We've also heard from various states, including Attorney General Rob Bonta out of California, that the states, the AGs and the secretaries of state are meeting and planning. All sounds very encouraging. Has the Brennan Center provided any guidance in that direction for folks to prepare?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we have guidance for the public that's on our website. We have a lot of resources, including some that we published just in the last couple of days, explaining all of the restrictions on, for example, federal troops or ICE agents at the polls or otherwise trying to interfere in an election. We have a lot of public resources, and we also, work in coalition with other groups, and we, provide briefings with stakeholders. We're in contact with sort of the relevant stakeholders in the states and elsewhere. So yes, I mean, this is, the Brennan Center has been very, very active in planning to ensure that we do have a smooth and fair and free election.
Yeah, thank you for the work the center does. In fact, for those who are not familiar, and many are familiar with the Brennan Center, and in fact, when I posted the promo for our session today, people were like, thank God for the Brennan Center. So, but for those not familiar, tell us about the Brennan Center and the work it's involved in.
Oh, sure. So we are a nonpartisan legal advocacy organization that fights to uphold and protect and defend, where necessary, the institutions of democracy and justice. And we do that through a range of different types of activities. We're sort of a combination of a think tank plus a legal advocacy organization. Sometimes we litigate, plus a communications hub. So a wide range of advocacy tools. And the Brennan Center has a number of different programs that focus on different areas of democracy and justice. I am senior director of the Liberty and National Security Program. So we, are working to advance effective national security policies that respect constitutional values and the rule of law. But we also have a number of programs under our democracy umbrella that work on things like voting rights, campaign finance, trying to ensure that we do have fair and free elections.
Really important work, which is why we've got you here. And so let's go into a couple of topics in the news. One came up in a big way right after the president's national address, and that's the concept of presidential emergency action documents. And so I've talked a bit about it. I did some research about it, and there's this kind of shadowy notion that there's some documents sitting in a safe in the White House that go back to Eisenhower. Perhaps, if I've got that right, that envision various scenarios that might permit a president, based on some existing laws authorities, that to interpret the scenario in a certain way and allow the president to take some extraordinary actions. Tell us about what that means, and if it's possible that Trump has authored some new emergency action documents.
Yeah, well, you said it very well. I mean, these are draft presidential orders, executive orders, and directives that are teed up ahead of time in anticipation of a wide range of worst case scenarios, so that they are ready to go into effect with just the president's signature if one of these emergency situations were to come to pass. They originated in the Eisenhower administration as part of efforts to ensure continuity of government in the wake of a possible Soviet nuclear attack. But over the decades, they've expanded to address other types of emergencies as well. They are extremely closely held. None of these documents has ever been publicly released or even leaked. But we do know a little bit about the contents of some of the older PEDs because of some other official documents that describe them. And what we know is that the presidential emergency action documents going up to about 1970 purported to do things like implement martial law, unilaterally suspend habeas corpus. In other words, the president suspends it rather than Congress, which is what the Constitution says. The roundup and detention of people who are on a list of subversives, a list that at one point apparently included about 10,000 people, warrantless seizure of property, and censorship of the press. These are actions that at the time under existing law, and certainly now, were illegal and or unconstitutional. And really the concern about these PEDs, and again, we know much less about the contents of current PEDs. We know that these documents do undergo periodic revision. And we know that as of the first Trump administration, they were undergoing one of these periodic revisions. And at the time, there were between 50 and 60 of them. So that much we know. But the reason why we worry about PEDs is this. Advanced planning is not a bad idea. That part is not worrisome. That's good. We want administrations to be thinking ahead. We want them to have plans that have really been thought through and carefully vetted from a legal perspective as well, so that they are ready to go. If we learned anything from COVID, we learned that advanced planning is really important. And when you don't have it, it's problematic. The thing that's worrisome about PEDs is that historically, they appeared to authorize actions that are illegal. And in combination with that, these documents are not shared, as far as we know, with anyone in Congress. So there is no independent oversight outside of the executive branch of these documents. That's really problematic, both because Congress needs to be included in advanced planning. Congress will have a role, but also to the extent that the administration is, purporting to do things under laws that don't allow it, Congress has a role in saying, no, that's not what this law is, or maybe changing the law if they need to. And it's quite remarkable that Congress has no oversight here, given that even the most highly classified covert military and intelligence operations by law have to be shared with, at least the so-called Gang of Eight. So that's why PEDs are particularly concerning, in my view.
Yeah, for sure. And we don't know what's in that safe right now. How did we even, you mentioned during the first Trump administration, there was an indication that they were perhaps revising.
Yeah.
How do we even know that?
That was part of a budget request by the Department of Justice. They wanted to, show how they were using the money and ask for the money. And they said, this is one of the things we're doing. We're reviewing these PEDs, but it didn't say anything about the contents of the PEDs. You mentioned something that's really important, which is that the actions in these documents have to rely on some kind of existing authority. The PEDs themselves are not laws. They cannot give the president powers that the president doesn't otherwise have under the Constitution or under laws passed by Congress. That's really important because I think some of the concern around PEDs is that they would somehow authorize actions that were otherwise unauthorized. And that's not the case. So I think that's an important distinction.
So clarify this for us, because you're telling us that a lot of what we know PEDs might have authorized or tried to authorize would be illegal, and
right.
But yet we hear about suspension of habeas corpus, the ability to just grab people off the streets, not necessarily probable cause, the ability, the issuance of general warrants, the ability to search and seize without probable cause. That sounds illegal to me, but yet
sure.
we think that's in the PEDs.
Well, that was in the PEDs. I mean, they underwent very substantial revision in the 1980s. Again, we don't really know what came out on the other side, but that was right after a period of time where there was a real reckoning over executive power in the wake of Watergate and COINTELPRO and CIA domestic spying and a whole bunch of other abuses. And it led to a very different approach, frankly, to national security and intelligence activities of the government. It is very possible that some of the more obvious overreaches in the early PEDs no longer exist. But we don't know that. And something that's important to realize is that even though these older documents were talking about things that were illegal, there was no way to test them in courts. There was no way to get a court to say, hey, wait a minute, that's illegal, because they weren't out there in the public, and they were never acted on as far as we know. So there was never a chance for an authoritative body, for the courts, to weigh in and say this exceeds what's permitted by law. That is one of the concerns also about current PEDs. They may not go quite as far as the old ones did, although who knows. But they almost certainly are pushing the boundaries. That's kind of the point of them to some extent.
Right.
And they're doing so in a context where neither of the other branches has any visibility or any ability to push back.
And the older ones, or any one that's already existing, could be dusted off and signed by Trump if he wanted to. Do I have that right?
Sure. Honestly, PEDs are a tool for presidents who really want to plan in advance. And they want to carefully think through their actions before engaging in them and make sure that all of the stakeholders in government have weighed in and that it's been thoroughly vetted from a legal and practical perspective. That's what PEDs are meant to accomplish. That doesn't really feel like the MO of this administration.
Are you implying there's not a lot of careful planning in advance?
So I would be more concerned. I mean, it's not that I'm not concerned about President Trump's possible reliance on PEDs that may have been drafted during his first administration or just in the last year and a half. I am equally concerned that he might act, spontaneously, off the cuff, and draft an executive order over a period of 24 hours and put it out there. And it's not like that order would somehow have more or less legal authority behind it just because there was a PED that somebody drafted in advance. So I'm equally, if not more, concerned about President Trump just sort of acting,
And then who would I share your concern? Yeah, just based on past experience, right? But so who has standing? Let's say here comes this executive order, or here comes a new PED out of the blue, and it's going to presumably mess with the election or try to. Who has standing to challenge this in court? Is it Congress saying, hey, you're, or who does that?
Sure. I mean, it depends on what the order tries to accomplish. If it is an order that has sort of a direct impact on voters, then voters can challenge it. Organizations that represent voters can challenge it under some of the federal laws that prevent interference with voting. In some cases, again, depending on what the order does, state officials, state or local election officials would have standing to challenge the order. I mean, President Trump has already tried in a number of different ways to interfere with the midterm, to have the federal government sort of intervene and interfere with the process that's going on for the midterm elections. And he is 0 for 20 in the courts.
That's right.
On these efforts. So people have had standing, they've gotten into court. There was a recent decision that on the mail-in on whether
Yes.
the Postal Service could
Yes.
could withhold mail-in ballots from certain people based on the federal government's list. That decision, that's in one circuit, the DC circuit, basically said it's not ripe yet because it hasn't happened yet. No, there hasn't. Nobody's really been affected by it yet. But it also said if and when this gets implemented, it strongly hinted that it would be illegal and would quickly be stopped.
Yep.
Meanwhile, a different circuit court, the First Circuit, actually said, no, we can address this now. And the First Circuit enjoined that executive order.
Right.
And in multiple other cases, courts have struck down other efforts by the president to, again, exert federal control.
Right, and that's mostly that the postal thing, the mail-in ballot thing, where the Postmaster General has actually said, "Yep, I'm on board with with not mailing ballots to certain people." That's closely aligned to the similar issue of demanding the states turn over their voter records, right? And then you have DHS
where the president is 0 for 17 in
exactly. I just wanted to get that out, because we need some more good news here.
Yeah.
I have to say, and for folks listening and wanting to check out the Brennan Center work, I was really impressed from an investigative standpoint on how we even, the kind of work that the painstaking work that Brennan Center has done and others, going through thousands of declassified documents and finding, glimpses of PADs because they're referenced. I mean, that is really impressive work where it's almost like a slip up in a declassified document. That's a PAD they're talking about, right? And trying to who does that? Who does that work?
Well, we filed a bunch of FOIA requests back, I want to say in 2018, and we heard back from the Bush Library, the George W. Bush Presidential Library. That was one of the places where we sent a FOIA request, and we heard back from them. I think they said they would get back to us, if I'm remembering correctly, in 24 years, which I don't know what you say to that. But they in fact got back to us sooner than that. It did take several years, but they did get back to us. I think I want to say 3 years ago, although I don't know.
Yeah.
Time works differently these days. But we actually got a lot of information, and librarians are wonderful people.
Yeah.
And they are not looking for reasons to withhold this information. They did withhold classified information, as they must, unless there's been a declassification review.
Sure.
But there were some redactions, but we did get a lot of information. And for example, what we learned from those documents was that the Bush administration did its own review of PADs after 9/11. So there were at least a couple of different occasions where they kind of went back over the PADs to see if they needed to revise them. And we learned that there were anywhere between 1 and 4 PADs that would have implemented the emergency in some way, we don't know what way, but would have somehow relied on the emergency powers in the Communications Act. And those are powers that allow the president to take over or shut down wire communications facilities.
Yeah.
So we don't know what was entailed in those PADs, but we know that is one of the emergency powers. That is one of the most potent and worrisome emergency powers, and that was the subject of somewhere between 1 and 4 PADs. We also know that there was a PAD at least on essentially revoking passports for international travel. And then another one that addressed habeas corpus. We don't know. This was right after the Supreme Court had ruled that Guantanamo detainees have a constitutional right to habeas corpus. So I'm hoping that revision was to narrow the scope of whatever that PAD was, but it doesn't appear that resulted in the revocation of any PAD. Anyway, there's a lot of information for people who are interested in doing that kind of digging and that kind of archival research.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
Yeah.
Good stuff. I urge people to check out the website at the Brennan Center. Well, since we're on the topic of powers we didn't have to think about, and secrecy it hasn't come up for a while. We just saw within the last week or so a court that has never been activated before called into action. And that is, if I've got it right, the Alien Terrorist deportation court created in 1996 and never utilized until now. What is this court, Liza, and what's going on?
This is a court. There's a number of district court judges that sit on this court. So these are, regular Article III district court judges who are selected by the Chief Justice to serve on this court for, I think, 5-year periods of time. And if the government wants to deport a non-citizen whom the government believes to be or asserts to be a terrorist under a very, very broad definition, and believes that any sort of public disclosure or disclosure to this person would harm national security, then they can proceed through this court. And the judges of this court decide whether this extremely sort of watered down definition of terrorist activity is present, such that the person can be deported. And this isn't just people who are here, without documentation. This includes, people with green cards, legal permanent residents, visa holders can be deported under this provision by this, under a ruling of this court. And probably the main reason why we haven't seen this used before is because it explicitly relies on secret evidence. And that raises major due process concerns in terms of the ability of the person whom the government is trying to deport to make their case for why they're not a terrorist and why they shouldn't be deported. There are some provisions for green card holders to have an attorney appointed, and that attorney can see the evidence, but that attorney cannot then confer with the person and say, hey, they're saying that you were here on this date, were you? And then that person could say, no, I wasn't. Here's my evidence that I was somewhere else, that kind of thing. And if you're not a green card holder, in theory, you might be able to see an unclassified summary of the evidence. But even then, if the government says that that's too much of a national security threat, then you can't even see that. There are some very serious due process concerns with that kind of a proceeding. And that's why, really, it hasn't been used. It's one reason why it hasn't been used. The other reason is because there are ample authorities under existing immigration law to deport people who are actually involved in some kind of terrorist activity, as long as the government has some actual evidence that they are involved.
We talked about this on our show Monday with Asha Rangappa from Yale, and presumably someone, on the other options you brought up. Yeah, I did that for a living. We prosecute people. We take down terror cells. There's lots of ways to deal with this, and we've had some serious terrorists on U.S. soil. But presumably, Liza, is it safe to infer that there's somebody locked up somewhere that they're targeting for this, and we don't know if they're getting any due process?
Yeah. I mean, we do know that the government submitted an application to the court. So it's sort of a two-step process. The government submits an application, and then if the judge determines, yes, this person, there is the description presented by the government would meet the definition of an alien terrorist, alien terrorist, then they move to a hearing. And then the hearing is where that person may or may not actually have any representation or have any ability to see the evidence. So there was an application, which is the first stage that the government submitted, and the judge reportedly sent it back and said, try again, and this time put more thought into it. The court said that the government should submit a more thoughtful application. That's not a great sign.
No,
but that doesn't give me a lot of confidence that the administration is sort of using this tool, responsibly. The other thing that's worrisome is that, again, the definition of alien terrorist includes people who espouse or support, principles associated with terrorism or terrorist groups or something like that. I don't have the language right on my tongue, but it's basically if somebody's speech is considered to be supportive of terrorism or terrorists, that person, even if they are a green card holder, can be deported on that basis. And we have seen the ways that this administration takes political discourse and political dissent and opposition to the administration's actions and characterizes that speech as terrorist or indicative of terrorism. And so there's a real concern here that people lawfully in this country who exercise their First Amendment rights to speak up about what this administration is doing could be labeled as supporters of terrorism by virtue of that speech and find themselves in this court without any due process.
Well, they're trying. The administration is trying to really stretch the definition of terrorist. We've seen it in, I think, is it NSPM 7? We've seen, he's instructed Pam Bondi at the time to treat Antifa like a designated terror organization. We've seen Secretary of State Rubio recently meet with 66 countries and try to talk them into viewing far left extremism as an international terror threat. So, I mean, the imagination runs wild with regard to who is in custody, who are they calling an alien terrorist, and are they trying to go with a left-wing terror theory, which may have the judge kind of scratching her head as well. We simply don't know. But if I hear you correctly, we will eventually get a glimpse of what's happening because there are going to be hearings, and will they be public?
Well, no, the hearings will not be public. So,
is there any public aspect of this, though? I seem to recall that they're at kind of the final stage would be public at some point. No?
I'm not sure I know the answer to what parts would be public. I mean, obviously, there was some public indication in this case that the judge had sent the application back. The actual evidence, the contents of the hearing itself, those are all going to be secret. In terms of the ultimate ruling and what happens, I'm guessing those are public, but I'm a little hesitant to say because I want to go back and check.
And there's an appellate, there's an appeal right somewhere.
Yes, to the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. Okay. That's right. Okay. Yeah.
And the Attorney General, who may or may not soon be Todd Blanche, has a part in this as well, right? Not in even an appeal, he can come back at it and
yes. I mean, the Department of Justice can appeal if the Alien Terrorist Removal Court rules against them. Okay. Absolutely.
Yeah. Wow. Go ahead. You were about to say something.
I kind of wanted to go back to national emergencies. Because there's one thing that I meant to say that I didn't quite get in when we were talking before that I think is important to understand. Because I talked about what a national emergency declaration doesn't do and that it doesn't give the president any direct powers over elections. And so I think it would be natural for people to wonder what it does do. When the president declares a national emergency, it unlocks powers that are contained in 137 different provisions of law that Congress has passed, all of which say something like, in a national emergency, the president can do X. And so these are, some of these powers are quite broad, such as the Communications Act power that I mentioned earlier. And are definitely worrisome in terms of some of the discretion that they give to the president and some of the powers that they give to the president. However, it's a finite universe of powers, and a national emergency declaration only gives the president those powers that Congress has provided. And that's why it's important to understand that it isn't a blank check, because you can look through these 137 powers. We have them on our website. We've cataloged them. We've organized them. There is not a single one that has in it the word election or voting or voter. So there none of these powers are designed in any way to give the president power over an election.
I love this, and I'm glad you brought it back up, because I think part of the strategy on the Trump side is to really instill this kind of expectation amongst everyone that, we're going to have a mess on our hands, and he's going to do something. And that may be true, but we're getting caught up in that. And what we're not hearing to equal or greater amount is what you're telling us, which is, yeah, he may try it, but he's not going to win. And I think we can take some encouragement from that. And from what the work is that the Brennan Center is doing. Sean, do we have the website or the page for the Brennan Center we can put up for folks who want to check it out? Is that available to us? If not, yep. The Brennan Center for Justice, folks, go to their page. You can take your favorite beverage with you, because you can really explore for quite some time. Liza, thank you for the work that you do and the center does. And gosh, as things go sideways, we might get you back on to hopefully reassure us again. But thanks for joining us today. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it. Yeah, it was a good, healthy discussion. Thank you. We'll see you next time. Thank you. All right, folks, thanks for joining us. I hope you got some real good takeaways from that. We've got to not get caught up in what Trump wants us to get caught up in, which is fear and intimidation. And it's discussions like this that help us to remember we've got justice on our side and the law on our side as well. Thanks to everyone at the Brennan Center. I will see you hopefully on Friday for what we call Frank Friday. We will wrap up the week's news and outrages and always end with some good news, just like we had today. I'll see you then. Thanks for joining us.